Jews began to settle in this piece of land that we know of as Israel today around the 1300 BCs, and the people that they had to contend with for the resources were known as the Canaanites. Now, there's a lot of debate as to who the Canaanites actually were. Some people say that they were the Phoenicians, but keep in mind that the Phoenicians were also a mishmash of cultures, kind of like the United States. There is also another theory by several historians that the Jews were also a Canaanite tribe, and that their culture just evolved to a point where they were able to subjugate everybody else. That's why some definitions of the word Canaanite are the humiliated ones. If you want a reference for how the Jews dealt with the Canaanites being on the land that God gave them, here is Deuteronomy 20 verse 16. You could find this in any Christian Bible, also the Torah. However, of these people's cities, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, you shall not allow any soul to live. By the year 1020 BC, the Jewish monarchy was established, and they had complete and total control of the land that we know of as Israel today. But by 930 BC, it was divided into the kingdom of Israel and that of Judah. The division between these two kingdoms left them open to an attack by the most powerful empire at the time, the Assyrians. By 722 BC, both Israel and Judah fell under their might. This was one of the first expulsions of Jews from their homeland into what was known as the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Yet the Assyrians, as unbeatable as they were, met their defeat at the hands of the Babylonians at the Battle of Nineveh in 612 BC. And you would figure, since the Babylonians defeated the oppressors of the Jews would be free, but that did not happen. By 586 BC, the Jews were conquered and enslaved by those Babylonians, and thousands of Jews made their first diaspora. Some traveled west to what we know of as Iraq, some went up north to Lebanon, even some of the borders of Turkey. 50 years later, in 538 BC, the Jews were freed and allowed to go back to their homeland due to the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquering the Babylonians and ending their rule and subjugation of these people. Now, we're about to approach the Hellenistic era, and there's something you need to know about this part of the world. Israel, Lebanon, Western Syria, it's known as the Levant. It is one of the most important pieces of land in the Mediterranean because you could see it connects Africa with Egypt, Asia to the east, and technically Turkey, which is a gateway to Europe. So it connects three continents together. 333 BC, Alexander the Great conquered the entirety of the Levant, giving him full control of this access point. For over 2 centuries, Israel and the entirety of the Levant was under the control of the Greeks until it fell back into Jewish hands around 140 BC. Inevitably, inescapably, like every empire that touches the Mediterranean at that time, they fell to the Romans in 63 BC. The Jews refused to stay subject to Roman rule, and they led 2 revolts with constant guerrilla warfare against their occupiers. The first Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire took place in 66 AD, and that resulted in an estimated 1 million deaths. The second revolt took place 70 years later, around 136 AD, which resulted in the death of another 500,000 Jews. Now, here's something you have to pay attention to after that revolt. We are looking at a census of the Jewish population in Israel made by the Jewish-Italian statistician Sergio della Pergola. As you could see, in the 1st century, and most likely for 1,000 years before, the majority of the population of Israel was Jews. That began to change once the Jews were massacred after the revolts and the Jews were exiled from Jerusalem. By the 5th century, Jews became a minority in Israel, while Christians became the majority. Let's talk about it. Roman leadership was determined to not only destroy the Jews, but the Jewish culture. They changed the name of their holy city of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina. At every major city, the Jews were persecuted. They were not allowed to live in Jerusalem, nor were they allowed to worship in the city. This led to a further diaspora of the Jews, fleeing now to Egypt, Turkey, southern Greece. As the centuries progressed, they fled all the way to the tip of Morocco, all the way to Spain and Italy, Iran, Iraq. For 2 centuries, Israel was run by pagan rule until 313 AD, when the Roman Empire converted to Christianity. By 335, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most holy church in all of Christianity, was built in Jerusalem, making Jerusalem now the holiest Christian city. The Roman Empire fell. That did nothing to the status of the Jews in Israel or Jerusalem. It simply became known as the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Jews were still kept from the land. At this time, Israel was no longer referred to as Israel. It was broken up into two spots, Syria Phoenice and Syria Palestina. Eventually, it was called Palestina Prima. Lands of the Palestines were further Christianized by the Byzantine Empire until they lost control of it to the Sassanid Persians in 614 AD. Yet Persian rule was short-lived, only for 15 years, when the Byzantines reclaimed it in 629. By 637 AD, the Byzantines and the Persians lost the entirety of their influence in Jerusalem as it fell into the hands of the Muslim caliphates, and Jerusalem fell peacefully. It was only at this time, after 500 years of exile, that the Jews were allowed to come back to live and worship in Jerusalem. The Muslims had very little interest in forcing conversions of Jews or Christians, since they were able to excise a tax on the non-believers called the jizya. So it was actually profitable for the Muslim landowners to make sure that they did not have too many converts. And 5 decades later, around 690 AD, the Muslims constructed the Dome of the Rock, one of the holiest sites in the entirety of Islam, and it's theorized that this is where Abraham was commanded to sacrifice Isaac. After the construction of the Dome of the Rock, Jerusalem has become a holy center for the three faiths: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. For 3 centuries, the Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived in relative peace. Jerusalem remained a holy city, while the lands of Palestine became economically stagnant. The population dropped within that time from about 1 million people to 300,000. There were a lot of Christians who left the lands of Israel to go to some parts of Europe, northern Africa, and there was an influx of Muslim population, of course, because Jerusalem did become a major Muslim holy city. By 1099 AD, the Christians decide to take back the Holy Lands, and they launch their first crusade. They succeed. They end up taking Jerusalem. When the Christians entered the gates of Jerusalem, amidst their holy city, they engaged in a slaughter of Jews and Muslims. The death toll is estimated to be between 10,000 to 75,000. For 2 centuries, Jerusalem and most of Palestine was like a game of hot potato between the Christians and the Muslims. The Christians would retake it, the Muslims would retake it. It was most notably retaken by Salah ad-Din in 1187 AD. Yet by the mid-1200s, the Christians and the Muslims had a much larger problem at their hands: the Mongol invasions, and they made it all the way into Gaza. While the French did make temporary alliances with the invading Mongols to weaken the Islamic caliphates, the Mongolian incursions were one of the deadliest threats to Western civilization. While the West does not want to admit it, they have the Mamluk Sultanate and their cavalry to thank for stopping the Mongol incursions into the Middle East from going further up north and out west. They ended up using the lands of Palestine as a buffer zone to keep them at bay. Unfortunately for the lands of Palestine, the Crusades and the Mongol incursions crushed the economy of this area. It ended up becoming a bit of a backwater. But something notable did happen. By the end of the 12th century, the majority of the population of Palestine were Muslim, but the population was so small, just over 225,000 people, when over 1,000 years ago, the total population was around 2.5 million. Something I want you to keep in mind about the Crusades. There were 9 of them in total, and the last one ended around 1290 AD. While Jerusalem was in the hands of the Christians, only Christians were allowed safe passage. The times that Jerusalem fell back into Muslim hands, everyone was allowed to worship. I am going to release part 2 tomorrow, and the goal of these posts will be to give as complete but brief of a history of Israel as possible. Let me know what you think, and thank you.